Le Sacer du Printemps by Igor Stravinsky. As you can tell just by hearing the title of this work, it is a French title. Knowing this will help you associate this work with Stravinsky, the only one of the composers in this unit who spent a good portion of his career in Paris. In terms of genre, this work is a ballet, and ballets are normally scored for orchestra. In this and in the final unit of this course, you'll run across a number of musical genres, and one way to tell all of these works apart is to find some way to remember their genres and their performing forces. Stravinsky wrote this ballet as a part of his work for the Ballet Russe. It's a ballet. It was written for a ballet company. It was written for a ballet company in Paris. Stravinsky worked for a ballet company in Paris, and it makes very good sense to associate this composition with this composer, as well as with this particular institution. Now, for the very first time in this course, I'm going to draw your attention to an example of musical nationalism. Nationalism was a preoccupation of the 19th century, so when you think of nationalism, you should think of 19th century culture. Indeed, you saw this with Wagner and Verdi, both of whom were in some way associated with the unification of their great nation states during the 19th century. People were interested in forming countries that reflected a cultural or a national identity. Now, nationalism has been ill-used in music historiography and certainly in the teaching of courses like this one here. In fact, the concept of musical nationalism has been greatly abused in music appreciation courses in particular. That's why you've heard nothing about it from me previously. But here at last we have an excellent, a perfect example of musical nationalism, because here we are confronted with a work that has a subject that is related to a particular country, and it actually uses melodies from that country in the score of the work itself. So Le Sacer du Printemps, although it has a French title, is a quintessentially Russian work because of these two details. Although the title itself, Le Sacer du Printemps, which means the rite of spring, does not seem to indicate a Russian subject, the subtitle of this work, Pictures of Pagan Russia, and by that it is meant prehistoric Russia, the time before Russia became Christian, is a very clear reference to that country. So the subtitle of this composition is something that you should remember for at least two reasons. First of all, it's a subtitle, and every time I've mentioned a subtitle in this course, it has shown up on a test someplace, and also because it points out the subject matter of this work. It identifies it with a composer from that country who worked for the Ballet Russe in Paris and whose ballets were generally on Russian subjects. Now, the Parisian ballet goers who attended the first performance of this work probably expected to see some sort of a story about peasant life in pre-Christian Russia, perhaps people in quaint costumes doing quaint folk dances. Well, they were in for quite a shock, because the rite of spring was a subject far racier than the sort of thing that was found on most ballet stages of the early 20th century. The rites that are referenced in the title of this composition, The Rite of Spring, are fertility rites, and since this is a story about prehistoric or pre-Christian Russia, it is about pagan fertility rite. Fertility is a matter that we don't think about very much these days unless it's a medical condition with which we have to deal. For primitive cultures, however, fertility was all important. The fertility of the land that brought forth food, the fertility of animals who produced food, sometimes clothing, sometimes labor, and of course the fertility of human beings. A culture can survive only if it reproduces. And anthropologists and archaeologists of the 19th and the early 20th century were well aware of the practices of primitive people in connection with these things. And fertility rites are pretty much universal. They normally have an element of communal sex in them, and sometimes they even culminate in human sacrifice. This is exactly what happens in this ballet. Now, although such things, pagan rites, sex, and human sacrifice, would not shock anyone today, and it is unfortunate that we've come to a point in history in which nothing seems to shock us anymore, people in 1913 who went to the premiere of this ballet had much to be excited about. This was not the sort of thing they were accustomed to seeing depicted on stage, and ballet is among the most explicit of the art. And they certainly were not prepared for what they were going to see on that occasion. In fact, this work caused a riot at its premiere in Paris in 1913. It started out as heckling during the overture to this composition and during the first act of the work, and gradually it escalated into a full-scale riot that actually spilled out onto the streets. The police were called and 40 people were arrested in connection with the riot. Now, the first performance of this work has been very well documented. It is, in fact, the subject of a documentary called Riot at the Right, and I encourage you to see the podcast that presents an excerpt of the reconstructed performance of this composition. You should be able to see the overture and the first scene of this work, the two segments of the work that we are going to examine. And in fact, the people of that time had plenty to riot about, not just in terms of the subject matter of the work. In fact, this work presents at least two important musical novelties, and I want you to take careful note of them. The first of them occurs right at the very beginning of the performance, and unfortunately it's the sort of thing that has not been documented in the reconstruction of the premiere of this composition, and something that we probably will not experience during our own time. That is, we are unlikely to find a bassoon player anywhere who could show us exactly what the bassoon solo at the very beginning of this composition sounded like in 1913. That is, the bassoon solo uses notes that were not played on that instrument before 1913, so the very first thing that the audience heard in the darkened theater at the Ballet Russe was a bassoonist struggling to play notes far higher than any bassoonist had ever been required to perform before in public. And the next musical novelty presents itself as soon as the curtain rises and we see the dance of the adolescents. Here the rather coarse gestures of the dancers on the stage are underscored by misplaced accents in the music. Basically the sort of thing where the music seems to be unbalanced because the wrong beats are emphasized. And you can see this simply by looking at the illustration of the music for this passage that you have before you. The accent is not on the first of each of the groups of four notes, so it doesn't sound regular, as it has been the case in most of the music we've heard to date. Indeed, Stravinsky does nothing to smooth off the rough edges of this passage, and he underscores the chaos by using dissonant harmonies on each of the notes of this irregular rhythmic pattern.